Thank you so much. There you go. There's the evidence. There you go. Thank you very much, Sarah. And it's such an incredible pleasure to work with Sarah. She's absolutely amazing. And I just saw that we have been joined as well by our incredible executive director and founder, Katie Fahey. A quick word, Katie, and her the results of her previous efforts have been ratified lately. She led an amazing effort in the state of Michigan to pass a constitutional amendment against gerrymandering. And from everything I know, that has gone very well lately, and that's no small undertaking whatsoever. In general, our organization has to do with a variety of methods to make government more responsive to the people. And in particular connection to gerrymandering and redistricting, the idea is that the people should be choosing their representatives and not the opposite. And so we're very glad to have our esteemed director with us. This is the first in what we anticipate to be a series of citizen engagement forums for this year. And we'll be mentioning later and getting on to other topics. But we began the series last year. The first one was, as a matter of fact, on redistricting, and it actually featured what I found a fascinating exercise where you could actually go in and draw and change maps. The second one that we had in September, toward the end of September, had to do with ranked choice voting. And that was really excellent, very well received. We had Karen McCormick, who was the mother, if you will, the founder of the ranked choice voting movement in the state of Maine, which was the first state to adopt that method. And we also had Sean Duggar, who'd been active in the mail tree race in New York City, which resulted in the election of Eric Adams, and Steve Barrett from New Jersey, and Harriet Wasserstrom from Houston. So that was and again, this is available if you're interested in that. We were marching King Day last week, and I struck up a conversation with this woman who told me that they're trying to put ranked choice balloting on the ballot for this November in Arizona. When I told her about this forum being available, she was so excited. And so we're really glad to be able to create a record. And for those of you who are unable to join us today, please know that it will be available on the People website. Couple quick things about what we've been doing as an organization. Last year, in response to really what was a surprise to everybody with the advent of the pandemic, was we did something called the SAVE Challenge. And we said we had great information from the National Vote at Home Institute. We had an excellent experience here in Arizona, where last year 80% of the people voted by mail. And so we were able to not only encourage people to take advantage of those opportunities and to try to help make them available. We had a presence in some 43 states, so letters to the editor and various other tactics. So we're very proud to do that. On top of that, and Sarah deserves most of the credit for this, we were able to put together a voter's resource guide, because with all those changes, it was challenging for a lot of citizens to know just where they could get reliable information on how they could vote safely and conveniently and well. And so we were able to identify a number of objective sources from different points of view, but to provide objective and accurate information that people, in some cases, it would take you by the hand according to your zip code and tell you exactly what you needed to do and not do in order to vote effectively. Of course, we all know the results of last year's election were that it was a record in various demographic groups and overall. And we were particularly glad to see that the youth vote, which everybody always is hoping is going to come about, really did. And so hopefully we can together do things to help recapture and regain that momentum. And so there's a couple things we've done as a background. I'd like to mention real quickly, we have a new initiative this year. Some of us were talking, and as this came on more and more about the violence and the threats here in Phoenix, there were people with AR-15s at the vote counting location. these workers who did an excellent job had to be escorted, had to have a police escort to get to their vehicles. And Republicans, Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, Anthony Gonzalez, congressman in Ohio. This is not a partisan issue, but to have violence, the threats of violence and intimidation impinge on our electoral process just seemed to us to be wrong. So we started something and it really caught on. It really captured people's imagination. We call it Peace at the Polls. Peace at the Polls. And so we were able to start with a physical activity here in Phoenix in cooperation with a number of groups. If you have that visual, Sarah, and that we had an event at the state capitol, marred slightly by some very obnoxious people with foghorns, but we won the day. There you go. We actually had a graphic design guy on the people who created that. And you see we had Mi Familia Vota, the League of Women Voters, actually organized and led the coalition, and a wonderful effort. Turns out 60% of members of League of Women Voters physically volunteer at the polls. So it was a very personal matter for them. African-American Christian clergy, interfaith clergy, SEIU, AFL-CIO, Common Cause, and ourselves up there on the right. And so really it was a tremendous coalition and a wonderful event. We carried that through to the other picture, which is Martin Luther King III. His wife and daughter were here on the Friday, January 15th, and we were able to march with them and cross over the bridge and back. Arizona, unfortunately, being the last state to ratify the King holiday. And so, do you have that other one, Sarah? And then again on Monday, the King holiday, we again marched with the banner and we're able to speak to the folks at the festival. So it's something that our comment is, at the very least, the electoral process and people's ability to vote and have their votes counted and to have a school board meeting should not be marred and disrupted by violence, threats, and intimidation, threatening people's children. I mean, if we're not better than that, then we've got big problems. But given that, I would just like to quickly make mention, and David will do a further introduction. I had the pleasure of meeting our first speaker, and you don't get to say this very often, on the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. last summer. And I had the privilege to be a freedom rider, and she gave a powerful speech, and she is one of the foremost authorities in the country on the legalities of voting rights, civil rights, and voting rights attorney for many years. And then we got to meet her again when she was out here for a rally sometime after that. So very glad she has agreed to join us. Equally excited for Dr. Lisa Tetreault from joining us from Pittsburgh. My co-chair and chair before that, Betty Murchison of North Carolina, and I hope and presume she's on the call with us now. But she had seen Lisa and so told us that she was just absolutely fascinating, and Betty's word goes. So we're very glad that the good doctor would join us as well. And I'm not sure if does anyone know if Chris Deschaney is now with us? I'll give it Chris Deschaney is a graduate of the Naval Academy in Annapolis, a Marine, was a state rep here in Arizona, and was the nominee for Secretary of State. The guy that beat him ended up being the front man for the Cyber Ninjas, for what it's worth. But Chris joined our committee meeting last year, and he told us how in the midst of the pandemic was truly raging on the Navajo res, beyond belief. And in the face of that and all kinds of other strange restrictions that you don't find outside of Indian country, he and a group of colleagues were able to focus their efforts on 5 or 6 states and actually come up with record positive turnout. And so we got to discuss that with him before we had to invite him back to figure out how he did it. So hopefully he will be with us. And so that is all I've got to say. And at this point, it's my pleasure to turn it over to our esteemed colleague, David Valente.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate everyone turning out for this important event to get a historical perspective on voting rights in America and the struggles that many individual communities have faced in attaining just the basic right to be heard and have their voice heard. Without further ado, and not having to see my face as much, we'll jump right into it. As Mike mentioned, our first speaker is Barbara Arnwine, Esquire. She's president and founder of the Transformative Justice Coalition, is internationally renowned for her contribution to critical justice issues, including the passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1991 and the 2006 reauthorization of certain provisions of that Voting Rights Act. She's prominent founder of Election Protection, the nation's largest nonpartisan voter protection coalition. This was launched in 2004 to assist historically disenfranchised persons to exercise their fundamental right to vote. Her work in voting and civil rights, in the voting and civil rights space, is unparalleled and unrivaled. And I am excited to hear from her. Ms. Arnwine, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all your hard work, for everything that everybody's been doing to really make sure that people understand the moment we're in and to be part of this fight over establishing a inclusive, robust, multiracial democracy. That's what the fight is. And it's been the fight since the first moment Europeans came to the United States and began the whole process of, land theft and, genocide and other, efforts against, the Native American population. And, it's just it's a horrendous story. And we know that in the Constitution, that originally under the way that the Constitution was constructed, that even Native Americans were denied voting rights, basically because of the fake, tribal sovereignty that was not really recognized in the Constitution. We also know that that Constitution embedded the entirety of slavery, even though you can't find the word slavery in the Constitution. You can't find the word enslaved. You can't find anything because the euphemistic, the racial denial was built into our foundational documents. Yet at the same time, there are, of course, several provisions, the 3/5 of a man provision, the most notorious, the extension of slavery into 1808. There's all these, there's all these elements of slavery that's in the document, the runaway slave provisions, the fugitive slave provisions, all of that. But none of it used the word slave, by the way, or slavery. But it's all euphemistic. It's all in racial denial. And that has been, sadly, the cast of our history to the present. I just want to, do this really quickly. I'm going to show you a couple of slides. And thank you, Sarah, for helping me because that's going to, help all of us to see what I'm talking about. So, I'm with the Transformative Justice Coalition. I founded this organization in 2015 after having headed up the National Lawyers Committee for over 25 years and having worked on everything from the Civil Rights Act of 1991 to, of course, the reauthorization of the voting rights provisions in 2006, and had a heavy role in that. So obviously, the state we're in now is just so unacceptable. But let's move to the next slide. When I teach, and I teach law at several institutions. I, taught at NCCU, for Columbia University, and for UCLA. Well, one of the things I use is this voting rights circle. This is a circle that basically starts with the fact that when in 1619, when Blacks were brought forcefully, enslaved Africans were brought forcefully to the shores of Virginia, which was not, by the way, the first slavery in the United States of Africans, because you got to go back to the Spanish to really pick up the real history, and St. Augustine and all the rest of it in Florida. But to get into the quote Anglo-Saxon version of this history of African Americans is enslaved in the United States, you go to 1619 and you talk about Jamestown. But we know that even during that period, that people were writing and demanding full citizenship. As soon as people could figure out a way to become freed, that they started demanding. We know that cases and petitions go all the way back to the earliest 1700s, people in Virginia demanding their voting rights. So this fight for voting rights was very early. And that circle of vote denial that starts in 1619 comes all the way through to today, where we're still fighting the same battles over vote denial and the denial of a multiracial democracy. So this is a historical document that basically carries you through the entirety of the circle of all the court cases, all the major incidents, all the populations, women, people without property, all of the vote denials, including the rights for young people to vote, the getting rid of poll taxes, all these issues that we had to struggle through. And this is it's one of my teaching devices that I love to use when I teach. Next slide. Before we get to this slide, let me say a couple of things. We all know the Civil War was critical to establishing the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, which are called the Reconstruction Amendments. And we know that the 15th Amendment was absolutely key. It was the last one, by the way, 1870. Why is it the last one? Because it's the hardest one for even Northern radical Republicans to accept. It was hotly debated about African-American men having the right to vote. And it was, interestingly, I don't know if the 15th Amendment ever would have been passed, but for the fact that you had a huge number of the Union soldiers and in 1870 were Black. People forget about, that incredible force of African-American soldiers who fought for their freedom and who demanded the right to vote, and had, in fact, Mary Frances Berry recounts, had threatened to march on Washington if they didn't get their right to vote. So there's a armed march on Washington if they didn't get the right to vote. So there's a whole lot of hidden, unknown history. And one thing I love doing is studying all that unknown history. Well, as you know, the 15th Amendment results in a powerful revolution of Black men voting. And of course, it's resisted from the first. Cato is killed in Pennsylvania. There are, major resistance in many states, but for at least a 5-year period, there is radical reconstruction. Black Congress people are elected, 16 Black Congress people. Over, I think they said probably about 2,000 Blacks elected to office nationwide during that period. And sadly, there's the Hayes-Tilden Compromise in 1877, and African Americans are betrayed. The radical Reconstructionists are silent, don't fight for the rights, and basically compromise them away, and most importantly, withdraw the Union troops out of the South. So all the protections are gone, and you see, therefore, we come to this slide, the Black massacres. You see, one thing that I find hard is that most people, when they teach our history, they don't want to talk about how brutal it was to establish this nation. That you had to, when there were 25 million Native Americans in the United States when the European invasion started. And today we know that number is down to 5 million. that didn't happen because people just left the geographical area. It happened because of the violence. And the same thing was true post slavery, leading to what we call slavery by another name era. But look at these massacres. And believe it or not, this is not a total slide. This is a slide of only the top ones. There are so many others that should be up here on this slide, but you can see look at the history of the periods of the 1875, 1873, just look, 1886, look at these horrible periods. And if I were teaching this as a law class, I would have you looking at, the Colfax massacre. And I would be pointing you to the Supreme Court's lack of protection of Black voters and during that time, and the misinterpretation and destruction of the 14th Amendment by the Supreme Court. But I'm not going to do that. Because I'm going to move on to this. And I'm loving the people in the chat are talking about some of the research they've done on some of these massacres and some of these horrific incidences. Now, coming more currently, after this period, let's talk for a minute before we talk about this slide. Let me talk about the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and let me talk about some other things that you should know. 1901, mark it in your notes. That is the last Black congressperson who is from North Carolina. He's from the 4th Congressional District of North Carolina, and his name is George White, Congressman George White. If you do nothing after this presentation, please Google Congressman George White's farewell address to Congress, 1901. If you really want to understand what happened to the Black vote, read it, because he talks about it on the floor of Congress. He's the last. He has been basically everything you can imagine has happened to his district. People have been maimed, people have been massacred, killed, people have been poll taxed, they have been denied the right to vote. Every form of voter suppression you can think of has happened, and he talks about it. And he predicts at the end, as he's the last Black serving congressperson, that like a phoenix, the quote, Negro will rise again. It will take from 1901 until 1901 until 1992 for the next Black congressperson to be elected from North Carolina. That will be Eva Clayton. It will take 6 decades for the first Black from the South to be elected. It will take 2 decades for another Black person to enter the Congress after his farewell address. But do read it, because it's powerful and it's everything that we need to know about that. It is Congressman George White, W-H-I-T-E, as in white. And he, in fact, leaves North Carolina and goes to Pennsylvania and forms what's called Whitesville. And it's a whole long story, but I won't go into all of that. But that brings us then to what people love to talk about, which is the modern, fight for what becomes the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I just wanted to stop there for just a moment, because you see, I wear my John Lewis button all the time. The Transformative Justice Coalition is committed to good trouble and everything, and we love the fight that John Lewis led. But before John Lewis, of course, there's Fannie Lou Hamer. Before them, there's Ida B. Wells Barnett. There's so many people who over the decades fought for voting rights. Even during the fight for the 19th Amendment, Black women were seminal to that fight, even though they ended up being denied the right to vote on the basis of their race. So that whole intersectional framework of intersectional failure and denial is there. in this voting rights challenge. And of course, it's 1923 before there's any attempt to give voting rights to quote, to Native Americans. And even then it's honored in the breach. I mean, there's so much, we can go through about how we have fought to get to to even where we are today and to expand the vote. But the battle of the 1900s is the battle to expand the vote. The battle of the 2000s is the battle to deny that vote. So so if you look at it in that framework, probably that's helpful. But let's talk a little bit about the Pettus Bridge. Amelia Boynton Robinson is a fighter in Selma. She's joined by Diane Nash, James Bevel, and many others who helped join her. John Lewis comes to Selma and he visits, and they say, we want to march because sadly, C.T. Vivian has been beaten and then Jimmy Lee Jackson is shot dead. And the people of Selma decide that they want to take his casket to Montgomery and to demand voting rights. And they're all, beaten and he's killed as part of, these voting rights marches that are being held in Marion, Alabama at that time. And so in Selma, people decide that they're going to do this march. John Lewis goes back to Atlanta and tells SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that he's going to march with the people of Selma, and he's told not to go. In fact, he's commanded not to go and told that he will lose his position as chairman of SNCC should he in fact march. He looks at the executive committee of SNCC and says, I'm going anyway. So if the people are going to march, I'm going to be with them. So be it. Do what you got to do. I'm going to march. And eventually, Hosea Williams and so many other people end up supporting him in Selma. And as we know, the Selma, they march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge and they're beaten savagely. Now, one thing I would say to all of you, March 3rd through the 6th of this year, there will be the annual reenactment of the Selma Bridge crossing. I hope that you will consider joining us in Selma. I hope that if you can't come personally, that you will join virtually, because we're going to be doing a lot of organizing and training and work to make sure that we can win for the people in 2022, that we can beat back all this voter suppression that is running rampant throughout the country. And this is an opportunity to walk in John Lewis's footsteps. But we know that he becomes one of the most powerful congressmen, and for 50 years will fight for voting rights throughout his life. The only other thing, and of course we know that during that period, James Reeb is killed, beaten savagely. Viola Liozzo is also beaten. These are white Americans who are giving their life. We know about the year before, about Goodman, Cheney, and Swerner, all of these things that have occurred to give us the right to vote, and how horrible this fight has been. But once the 1965 Voting Rights Act is passed, within 3 years, African-American voter registration goes from some states 5% to over 65%. That is how powerful that act is. It is amazing what a single piece of legislation can do. Moving on to the current, to this slide that you're looking at. This is 2011. This is the map of shame that I produced in 2011 to basically try to shock the nation into awareness that we were in a new era of voter denial and voter suppression. And when I put this map out here, I was told the STFU by a whole lot of people. Let me be very clear. It was not popular. I was told that I would lose my job, that I needed to stop because the narrative was post-racial America, that after all, Obama had been elected, He was up for re-election, and they didn't want the quote racial, this whole racial narrative inserted. I'm like, are you crazy? Did you see what happened in 2000 in Florida? Are you crazy? That was the problem there, was that we were in racial denial and would not deal with the fact that over 90,000 Black votes were wrongfully discarded in Florida. We sued about that after the fact. And we said, never again will we wait to assert our rights, after the fact. That's why we created, election protection. That's why we created all these things. But anyway, so 2011, I create the map of shame. People are stunned by it. People are really moved by it. I end up giving 150 speeches in, 100 speeches in 2011, and over another 150 speeches about this in 2012, to get people to really understand the battle that we're in this moment, that this is not just some casual people concerned about election integrity. It's not some kind of reawakening of some kind of voting electoral, process protection. This is all about denying the demographic change, that people are seeing that there's a new demography taking over the country, and they don't want that to happen, that they want to still have artificial white dominance. So that is, and then, just quickly, we have the Shelby case that comes, and then we have, all of these other things. But I'm going to stop there because I think that kind of brings us up to where we are today. A lot of us have been fighting, of course, this new wave of voter suppression that's now in its 11th year. And we have been, seeking to pass the magnificent Freedom to Vote, John R. Lewis Act, and our Congress, once again, through our Senate, our US Senate, really abdicated their responsibilities. We could talk a lot about the negative influence of money and the buying of the Senate, but that's another, story. The buying of the Senate and what that means. And we could move to the next slide, Sarah, quickly. And I will stop, once we do that slide. That's the Shelby case in 2013, where the Supreme Court gets in on the game and basically strips the power of Section 4's coverage. There were 1,200 jurisdictions, political jurisdictions covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, that basically said before any state can institute a change in practice, law, or procedure, they had to pre-clear it if they had a history of racial discrimination. And it had designated 9 such states and over 1,200 jurisdictions that had that history, believe it or not, and were subjected to those, and over 50,000 different challenges to different laws for discriminatory intent, purpose, operation, effect were part of that regimen. The next slide quickly. If you want to know more about voter suppression, get a feel for it, go to our website, which is votingrightsalliance.org. That's one of the places where you're going to see the 60 forms of voter suppression. And then you will just, and then I just had a lot of slides about the work we've been doing with votercades, with postcards, with Georgia, with all these fights, with the acts. But I just will end here and just thank you so much for all of everything. You can also follow our more recent actions at tjcoalition.org. tjcoalition.org is our organizational website. We're putting on a major program tomorrow night with some of the top leaders, thinkers, activists in this country on voting rights. We're doing that program at 7 o'clock Eastern. and it's going to be on Facebook Live under Transformative Justice Coalition. So that's another opportunity for everybody to learn. This Black concentration map just shows you how concentrated the African American population is in the South and why we're having so many problems with so many of those states, but you can also see Black concentration in other places. So people will know that it was really really important. And yes, we can talk about the filibuster, about Sinema, about Manchin, because I've actually sat down with Manchin. I've actually protested, been arrested in Arizona with many of the great people there, and arrested, here in Capitol Hill and so many other places as we have fought, for the voting rights. But just thank you, everybody. I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much for addressing us. We'll hold up on questions until question and answer period after all the speakers have spoken. And we'll move to our next guest. Professor Lisa Tetrault. Dr. Tetrault specializes in the history of gender, race, and American democracy with a focus on social movements and social memory. So she's an author. She penned The Myth of Seneca Falls, Memory of Women's Suffrage Movement, 1848 to 1898 in 2014, and that won the Organization of American Historians' inaugural Mary Jurek Nicholas Women's History Book Prize. She has been a historical consultant to the Woodrow Wilson House Memorial Women's Suffrage Initiative and on PBS American Experience documentary, The Vote, which chronicled the women's suffrage movement, and also on Ancestry.com's Women's Suffrage Project. So it's my pleasure to introduce Lisa Tetrault. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you for the little prompt to unmute myself. That's helpful because it seems like we always start muted. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about this issue. And thanks to Ms. Ardenwein for that impassioned defense of and plea for the people's power and our access to voting. I'm actually going to cover very similar terrain, but more in kind of like classroom style. So hopefully I'll be as equally engaging, but in some ways our talks dovetail together really well because I'm going to be covering some of that history as well. But what I want to focus on is the legality of why we can vote. So one of the things that happened.
Unmute.
I don't know how I got muted again, but one of the things that happened for me recently was that having written this book on the myth of Seneca Falls, talking about where that story comes from and how it's not a very useful story and thinking about voting, I got pulled into the recent centennial of the 19th Amendment, which just happened over 1919 and 1920. And one of the things that I decided to do during that centennial was try to start talking about something that a lot of people weren't aware of, and that is that there is no right to vote, at least not in the way that we imagine it. And that talk has now since grown into a book that I'm working on. And so what I'm going to talk about is that legality of voting, because I think we talk a lot about the right to vote without understanding its legal underpinnings. Now, I'm no lawyer like Ms. Ardenwein, and so she can chime in at any moment. But what I'll bring up my slides. Let's see, can you see that? Does that look?
Yes,
okay.
we got it.
So what I want to focus on is this question of why can you vote? What legally empowers you to vote? And why doesn't everyone just chat in quickly what you think the answer is? Why are you able to vote? What is it that legally empowers you to vote? Where did your right to vote come from? Can people chat in and talk about that? What's its legal basis, right? Because any right we have has to exist somewhere in law. So I'm curious what people think about what empowers them. So far, crickets. Is that because what? Okay, we've got the ERA, we've got my citizenship. Okay. This is where the prof can wait you out, because I got really good at that. One of the things they tell profs to do is count to 10 until people answer in your head and just wait them out. So, okay, states allow you to vote. It's a norm, it's a state law, okay? Birthright as citizens and national citizens, okay? Located where? If it's a birthright, where does it come from? Amendments to the Constitution, the 15th and the 19th, and franchise. Citizenship and turn to 18 and register, okay? Would anyone say the Constitution? Some people say the amendments to the Constitution. Would anyone say the Constitution? A lot of people have said state law. And citizenship. A lot of people think citizenship confers suffrage. So what I'm here today is say none of those things are true. We actually have no right to vote, and it exists nowhere in law, which is shocking because we talk constantly about our right to vote. And it turns out we're weird as a constitutional democracy. We are one of the only constitutional democracies still on this globe, and there are about 140 of them, that includes in their founding charter. Let's see, how do I advance my slides when I'm in this mode? Hold on just a second. I don't see, I think if I move this, sorry, one of those technical issues. Here we go. It turns out originally in the Constitution, the right to vote was never created. It was left to the states to decide who could or couldn't vote. And basically the states could draw up whatever criteria they wanted because there was no preceding right that they were abridging, right? So states, what they did is draw up voter qualification laws, and you were a voter if you could clear those qualifications, right? Not because you were invested with a right, but only because you cleared the qualifications. And it turns out, even though we talk about the changes in American democracy and the expansion in voting and the expansion in the right to vote, that has never changed in American history. The right to vote has never been created as a national right of citizenship. In fact, the Supreme Court has been extremely clear, as I'll say today, that there is no right to vote in the Constitution then or now, and no citizen is invested with a right to vote. It is a privilege. It is a privilege that the states then and now can regulate and bar on just about any grounds they want. It remains a state prerogative, except for the handful of things that social movements have insisted they can't use, okay? But what we're gonna look at today is a game of whack-a-mole, essentially. And so where a lot of people tell the story of voting rights as a changing story over time, I tend to tell it as a story of stasis. Not because those changes aren't important, they're massively important, but there is lurking behind them another massively important story, and that is the staunch refusal of the United States government to ever create a right to vote. And that story of stasis is one whereby at the founding, there is no right to vote for anyone. The states set up obstacles or voting eligibility law, right? You clear that, you vote, you don't clear it, you don't vote. Social movements come along and strike down some of those obstacles at the state level, and then the states pop up new ones. And then social movements leverage the federal government to strike down other restrictions, and then the states pop up new ones. And essentially, it's been a never-ending cycle over American history. And we are back right now for a variety of reasons, which we'll get to in this talk here, back in a state where the states are popping up a ton of them. And they are legally allowed to do so because they're not abridging the handful of things that have been banned by the federal government, and they are not abridging anyone's right to vote because there is no right to vote. The people are not invested with a right to vote. And the US government and the Supreme Court have been incredibly clear about this across time. So let me get to that story. So the states, again, from the founding, regulate suffrage. And at the founding, the things that the states used to bar people from suffrage or regulate the suffrage or protect the suffrage, however you want to think about this, have varied over time. And we are now in an era where there's a whole new set of things like voter ID laws and all kinds of things. But at the founding, the one thread that people thought was required was the idea of property. And that was because that made you an independent person capable of independent thought, and therefore you would govern according to the larger good, and you would want things to work for the larger good so that your property was protected. But interestingly, you may or may not know that at the founding, race and sex were not uniformly required. Like you did not have to be white in all states to vote, nor did you have to be male in all states to vote at the founding. That comes about later for complicated reasons. But In many, many states, race was not a criteria. So if you were an African-American, but sex was in all states a criteria, you had to be male, except New Jersey. New Jersey did not have a sex criteria. So in many, many states, if you were African-American with sufficient property and you were male, you could vote. And in New Jersey, if you were a woman with sufficient property, Black or white, you could also vote. And it's clear from the historical record that people did. That changes in 1807. And by the time we get to the 1820s and 30s, for complicated reasons that I can't go into in this talk, the United States has really dropped property qualifications, largely because of the expansion of slavery and the rise of industrialism. And really what we get by the 1820s and 30s in the United States is almost all states dropping property requirements, but demanding that voters, now all states require that they be white and male. So women who were voting and African-Americans who were voting and African-American women who were voting are all now banned from voting. Okay, it's not like they never voted. They did for a while. But by the 1820s and 30s, states now have used this criteria of white and male. And it was white men really who popped down the property qualification and brought up the idea that their whiteness and their maleness should be sufficient for their excellence. And then there were lots of people in this antebellum era, in this pre-Civil War era, who launched voting rights campaigns, what they would call voting rights campaigns. People routinely refer to their right to vote, but don't really define it legally. Because we believe we are possessed of that right, even if we don't legally possess that right. So there are all sorts of African-American calls for not only the abolition and the immediate cessation of slavery, but also for voting, right? The restoration of Black men's voting in many places, and the creation of voting for African-Americans in many places. And there are women also starting a suffrage movement in this era, arguing for their right to vote. And what they do, though, in this era is they would never think of creating a constitutional amendment, which is usually how we tell the story, right? You know, African-American men win the 15th Amendment, women win the 19th Amendment, right? I mean, there's this. These people would have thought they had to go state by state by state, striking the word male in every state constitution. They would have never thought to go for a constitutional amendment because the federal government had no prerogative over suffrage. So you would not use the federal government to regulate suffrage or to achieve suffrage. You would have to do it by negating these words in state constitutions. And that's how people fought for it. There were, however, some very imaginative African-American activists in this era who began arguing for the idea that there should be a federal amendment that actually gave people the right to vote. That's where the idea comes from, okay? But it doesn't actually gain traction until the American Civil War. And it's really the American Civil War that brings the idea of using the federal government and using the Constitution to defeat state obstacles to voting to life. Because two things are settled by the African-Americans, by the American Civil War. One is that chattel slavery, at least as an official institution, is dead. And secondly, that we are still a whole nation, right? We are one nation. But then an entire other war breaks out, known as Reconstruction, which is how will we reintegrate these rebel states into the United States? And also, how will we bring into our nation 4 million freed people, right? Who are what? Governed by the same laws as white people? We don't know. Before this, they were often governed by a different set of laws. Are they citizens? We don't know, right? No one knows. And African Americans have their own claims upon freedom. And then everyone's fighting for sort of what, how are we going to do all these things? And as Ms. Arnwine mentioned, there are the 3 amendments that get passed. 13th, which abolishes slavery. 14th, which establishes birthright citizenship, equal protection, and guarantee equal protection under the laws, and you can't, I'm blanking all of a sudden.
Due process.
Thank you. You can't deprive people of their rights, without due process of law.
Exactly.
Okay. And the 14th Amendment becomes absolutely critical to all social movements moving forward. But at the time, it's meant to try to protect African Americans. And then the 15th Amendment, African Americans are demanding more than these things, but this is what Congress is willing to grant. The 15th Amendment comes along. And they say, because African Americans are being slaughtered across the South, right? I mean, slaughtered. The violence is not over. And one of the things that Frederick Douglass and plenty of other African American statesmen who have the voices of Congress and the freed people who are arriving in Congress are saying is we need the vote to protect our lives, right? We need the vote for self-determination, we need it. And so in the 15th Amendment, Congress finally agrees to that, and they pass the 15th Amendment, which is highly controversial when it passes. It's the last of the Reconstruction Amendments. And this is the so-called Black Male Suffrage Amendment, although it doesn't mention Black or men in the entire amendment, I might point out, and we'll get to that in a minute. But what's highly controversial about the amendment is not only who it enfranchises, which is a revolution in democracy, but also that the federal government is using its power to regulate suffrage at the state level. That is considered wildly unconstitutional by many people. So what you'll get is the South saying this is a federal overreach, right? This is an overreach into state power. And I should point out that there were many different proposals for the 15th Amendment made, but let's look at what actually passed because it matters a lot. This is what the 15th Amendment says. It's ratified in 1870. And you'll see there is no African-American or male mentioned in this entire amendment. It doesn't confer anything upon those people. They're not even here. What it says is the right of citizens to vote, right, which is something that we all imagine, but is actually not legally founded. It has no, it's an imaginary right, shall not be denied or abridged. It's negatively phrased. And then it goes on to say by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And that Congress, and this is a big deal, shall have the power to enforce this article by legislation. So in other words, it's giving congressional oversight over the enforcement of the 15th Amendment over the states. So what does this do? Let's go to our teacherly mode. If we go back, so what does this do? How does this create Black male suffrage? Why Black male suffrage? There's no Black and there's no male in here. What's going on? What did those, let's go back. What did those states all have in their constitutions uniformly across the United States, even in the North? That voters had to be white and male. So what does the 15th Amendment do to those state constitutions? What does it strike out? You can't use race as a qualification. So what happens? Somebody shout it out. This is the interactive part of the demonstration. It strikes out the word white, right? So actually what it does is regulate the states. It says to the states, you can't use this one qualification for voting. And the reason men are enfranchised is because male is still required. So Black women are not enfranchised by this because male still exists in all state constitutions. All right. All right, but let's look at this. It doesn't positively give the right to vote to anyone. What it does is just says to the states, on this one criteria, you may no longer use that criteria. That is highly significant because it does not create a right to vote, even though it is often said to. And this will be very important moving forward. And I should point out that there were many people at this time who wanted to create a right to vote. Many people, including African Americans, argued we should add an amendment to the Constitution that said all citizens should be possessed of a right to vote because of their citizenship, right, which is what many of you thought you have, which you don't if you're citizens, and the federal government should regulate suffrage, not the states. That is a bridge too far, partly because the North really likes discriminating, and those Northern Congress people don't want to give up the right to discriminate at the state level in voting. Okay, so what we get is a negative conferral. We don't get the conferral of rights on anyone. What we do is get voting access for Black men, which is a revolution in democracy, all right? I mean, it cannot be underestimated in its importance, but there is also this backstory that is also important. Then we get the so-called women's suffrage movement, or largely white women, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who are super pissed off about this, all right? Because they say, where's sex, right? Why aren't we enfranchised? Why aren't we striking down the word male too? And they'll do some horribly racist and ugly things opposing the 15th Amendment, which we're not going to go into here today, but I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A. And eventually they will bring about another amendment to the Constitution through the long so-called women's suffrage movement. And look at the language. It's exactly the same as the 15th Amendment, exactly the same. It's negatively worded, not positively worded. And nowhere are women mentioned in the 19th Amendment. Again, the 19th Amendment is aimed at the states, not at women. It does not confer anything on the women. It says the right of citizens to vote, again, an imaginary fiction, but a powerful one in our nation, shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And again, Congress shall have the power to enforce. Okay, so now states are still allowed to raise any voting criteria they want because there is no preceding right to vote that they're violating, save for two, right? Social movements have leveraged the power of the federal government in two cases. You can't use the word male and you can't use the word white, all right? And so for a while, there is a biracial democracy across the United States. And then there are two more amendments to the Constitution. Let me just quickly go through them. The 24th Amendment passes in 1964 as a result of the student protest movements of the 1960s. People being drafted to Vietnam, fighting in a war, but not able to vote because 21 was the voting age. And this again is worded exactly the same way, right? It's the Fourth Amendment or the Third Amendment that goes to the Constitution. The right of citizens to vote in federal elections shall not be denied or abridged by, 24th Amendment is not that, so 26th. This is the poll tax amendment, by reason of to pay a poll tax or any other tax. But notice they don't strike this down in state elections, only in the federal election, because they say that's all they have the prerogative to do. And again, Congress shall have the power to enforce. So this says poll taxes are illegal. And then you get the 26th Amendment, which is the 18 years old. Again, exactly the same language, negative language, policing the states, not conferring anything upon 18-year-olds, right? The states shall not be, 18-year-olds cannot have their rights denied or abridged by the United States or any state, and Congress shall have the power to enforce, okay? Those are the only four amendments in the Constitution that regulate voting. And those are the only four grounds in the Constitution on which states cannot disenfranchise legally, constitutionally, right? On all other grounds, they can disenfranchise. Do you see the danger that's left open here? What's left open by all these amendments is the possibility of another route to discrimination, which is precisely what happens, okay? So if we look, for example, at this language, what eventually happens is that Congress gets tired of enforcing the 15th Amendment. They were never all that committed to it in the first place. And the vigilante, the violence that, that you just saw on that map as a small sampling of the violence continues across the South. And eventually Congress just doesn't have the willpower to continue to enforce Black male voting, all right? To continue to, they have troops in the South, they pull them out in 1877, the so-called end of Reconstruction. And at this point, there is an overthrow of biracial democracies across the South on the grounds that they were incompetent, which is absolutely false. They did radically important things. White supremacist governments take over and they're like, we're effectively keeping many Black men from voting, although surprisingly, Black men were quite resilient, as were Black women, in making sure that everyone got to the polls through violence. But we would really like to have a legal way to disenfranchise them. But they don't try that until, here's some of the Black representatives that go to Congress, again, from the South. The first Black representatives to the United States Congress will go from the South because of Black male voting. But this violence, and I'll go across that because that's a really triggering image. But what the South finally realizes by the white supremacist South by 1890 is that the North doesn't care anymore. And so they start floating some new laws, right? That kind of technically abide by the 15th Amendment, but start disenfranchising Black men. So this is the era of the creation of Jim Crow voter laws in 1890 to 1913. You get poll taxes and you get literacy tests, neither of which have been banned, right? And neither of which abridge anyone's right to vote because nobody has a right to vote, right? It doesn't use race technically, although these were absolutely targeted at folks of color. But also these are not only passed in the South, these are passed across the United States, which is trying to purify kind of the white vote from the intrusions of people of color. Then you get, the advancement of, I was going to say, okay, so do you see why I'm saying that lack of a right is so important? Because this is where we start to see the whack-a-mole game, right? We see the creation of Black male suffrage after the Civil War, and then we see its absolute denial and suppression by the 1890s, which continues with vigilante violence. But once you've got laws to do it, you don't have to look quite so heathen and barbaric using so much violence. Again, Black men are reduced to minuscule proportions of being able to register to vote. And then we have the same story for so-called women's suffrage, which is a complicated category because, of course, women cut across many, many racial groups. But the Western states start voluntarily dropping the word male from their constitution before 1920. So tons and tons of women are voting out West. And you often see triumphal images. This is from 1915. It's a lithograph, votes for women, it says on the Cape. And you can see all these states have votes for women, and all these people in the East are clamoring for this, this reform. But this is going on this is 1915, right? This supposed expansion of American democracy is going on at exactly the same time as this collapse of American democracy, right? These are simultaneous stories. The United States is never a story of steady opening. It is a story of opening and collapse for different groups of people. And then, this goes through in 1920, and you get the same kind of claims then that we have now, that it gave women of the entire nation the vote, right? Or things, if you go to ourdocuments.gov, this is what ourdocuments.gov says right now on the interwebs, that the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote, and it guarantees to all American women the right to vote. No, it doesn't. It does not. And every time we say that, we falsely tell ourselves that we are invested with a right that can't be taken away, when it absolutely can be. And we're seeing that in action right now. This is what the 19th Amendment says. States can't deny or abridge. So what happens after the 19th Amendment? Not all women are guaranteed the right to vote. No women are guaranteed the right to vote by this amendment. There's no language in here that guarantees women voting. What happens is that all the people who are ensnared in the states that pass these laws no longer have male as a hurdle, right? Black women, Indigenous women, Latina women no longer have male as a barrier, but they have Jim Crow laws as a barrier. So it's not that this enfranchises only white women, it's that the states have kept a way to keep many. So millions of women are voting before the 19th Amendment out West and other places. Millions of women are voting after the 19th Amendment, and millions of women still aren't voting after the 19th Amendment because of all the Jim Crow voting laws, which were not just in the South, they were across all the country. Then also, a lot of states start requiring citizenship for voting, although you may be surprised to know that across the 19th century, citizenship was not a routine requirement for voting in most states. But by the end of the 19th century, it is, partly because of the massive waves of immigration of people of color, and the United States wants to keep them out, or at least white supremacists do. So then for a lot of people, what they need is first citizenship. And so the citizenship laws, for example, in 1875, the United States passes its first racial exclusion law, which keeps out Chinese and Asian American women, or Asian women, because they're presumed to be prostitutes, right? And then in the 1880s, we get the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is the other first exclusionary act in US immigration, which keeps out all Asian Americans. And they're not going to be granted citizenship until the 1950s, right? And then we have the complicated story of Indigenous Americans who often didn't want citizenship because it was colonization. They're right, I don't want your right to vote because your right to vote means my subjugation. Do you see it, right? It was colonization essentially. And so that was a mixed view among Indigenous groups about whether they did or didn't want to use the vote. And then you had Latino Americans and Latinx folks who were also kept out of citizenship. So what I'm trying to say is there's no one date at which anyone gets the right to vote because so many different of our identities cut through, and it depends on our citizenship and what our state laws are. Then you get the 1965 signing of the Voting Rights Act, right, which is the other big piece of legislation that regulates the states. But it is a piece of federal legislation as opposed to a constitutional amendment. But it, despite its name, also does not give the right to vote to anyone. It does the same thing the constitutional amendments does. It uses federal law to police the states on a number of fronts, but a limited number of fronts. It sends federal agents into the South to register people to vote. It deputizes African Americans to register people to vote. And as Attorney Arnwine said, the numbers of African Americans registered to vote, male and female, catapults. And this is also a women's, rights victory. As you can see, there are women here in this picture who also were fighting for voting rights. But the suffrage movement didn't end in 1920, or I should say women's fight for the vote didn't end in 1920. And mostly white women say, screw you to this group of African-American women who don't have the right to vote, and Latino Americans. But this basically says to the South, you can't really, in some ways, the signing of the Voting Rights Act is monumentally important and also deeply depressing. It's triumphant and depressing because the beginning of the Voting Rights Act says, an act to enforce the 15th Amendment. It's 100 years later, US. You're finally going to go down south and reinforce the 15th Amendment. Like, that's pretty depressing that it took African Americans 100 years to get the federal government to pay attention again and use its power. It's also heroic and impressive and triumphant. But African American voting rates skyrocket. And the one thing that the signing of the Voting Rights Act also does is says to states with histories of racial exclusion and racial discrimination, we are going to put you under federal oversight, right? And through our power, because Congress has the power to enforce, right? And the Department of Justice puts these jurisdictions under what's known as preclearance. In other words, you can't pass voting laws until you give them to us first. We, the Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division, will decide if those laws are racially exclusionary, because you have a habit of doing that. And if they're not, they can go into effect. But if they are, we're going to strike them down preemptively. You can't even put them into effect. That's called preclearance. And that has kept a whole raft of racist legislation at the state level at bay, right? Just preemptively. Again, millions, really, we become a biracial democracy for the first time after the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And again, as she said, registration rates go from 3% to 65 to 85% within just a few years. And I discussed preclearance. Then in 2011, we start to get, as she said, as she created her map of shame, being very obviously having her antennae up in 2011, there start to be these accusations of voter fraud start to pick up, okay, with absolutely no evidence, but this is really when you can detect them on the radar. And there's a whole story about how and why that happens in 2011. But let me just go to what really allowed this to take off. And there was, for example, what started to be passed in 2011 were these voter ID laws. And Texas passed a voter ID law, for example, after the 2011 voter, but the DOJ struck it down as racially exclusionary, right? It was clearly meant to be racially exclusionary and the DOJ struck it down. Hold that thought. Before it could go into effect. Enter Shelby County v. Holder, 2013. Basically, Alabama says we are in a post-racial era. This idea of the Voting Rights Act, that we need to be surveilled by the federal government because we are racially discriminatory, discriminatory is a thing of the past. There is no racial discrimination anymore. And this is a federal overreach into state power. And Attorney General, or the Chief Justice John Robert agrees, the court agrees, and they write an opinion in Shelby County v. Holder that strikes down the Voting Rights Act provision of preclearance, taking away the ability of the Department of Justice to preemptively strike down. What does Texas do? 2 hours after the decision, it puts in place its voter ID law. 2 hours after the decision, which the DOJ had already decided was racially discriminatory. I might add that John Roberts' job in the 1980s as a very young man was in the Reagan DOJ to try to prevent the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 1982, which he finally successfully kills with Shelby County v. Holder. Since then, there have been waves of state voter laws, not just around race, but largely around race, partly because preclearance is dead and because we have no right to vote. And so now the states are coming up with all kinds of new ways to figure out how to suppress voting or how to regulate voting, right? And you have to decide for yourself, is this voter, is there voter fraud that these laws are responding to? There's no evidence that there is, but a lot of people want to claim there is, or is this outright voter suppression, right? And I should say that all the federal legislation, and this is where I'll close, all the federal legislation that's being proposed right now, while wildly important, is again part of the exact same cycle. It is not about creating or protecting a right to vote. It is about regulating the state's behavior on a couple of different fronts, okay? It is about striking down a couple of abusive state practices, or we should say discriminatory, or we should say a couple of state obstacles, right? That's what it's about. It's not about creating a right to vote. And then there's this whole question after Shelby County v. Holder that even if the feds did pass it, would the Supreme Court uphold it as a federal overreach? Because during Shelby County v. Holder, they said that that was an overreach into state power. And so it's unclear if the federal legislation even passes, whether the Supreme Court might strike it down as a federal overreach into a state power. There's no doubt across the world and across, in all independent assessments of an American democracy, and this is from before the 2016 American election, that we are no longer a fully functioning democracy. We do not rank as a fully functioning democracy anymore. And we are one of the only democracies in the world that, like I said, do not have a positive right to vote. And I can talk about later during the Q&A if you want. There have been lots of demands across American history for a positive right to vote, for the creation of investing citizens with something that the states can't abridge. And the Supreme Court has routinely said that the Constitution gives no citizen the right to vote. Voting is a privilege, not a right, and it can therefore be denied on any grounds that states see fit, except for the ones that the federal government has said. And the Supreme Court has consistently held that. They said the Constitution gives no citizens the right to vote. The voting is a privilege. They would also say that in Bush v. Gore in 2020, right? So that is this consistent stance. So I will stop there. And so I think it matters a lot as we're talking about voting rights, that we understand that that right doesn't actually have any legal basis. And that matters a lot. And never has. And that is a weird feature of American democracy. Okay, we are super weird in that regard, that we don't give our citizens voting rights. All right, I'll end there.
All right, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. That was very informative. Let's move on to our next guest. Chris Deschaney is a former Arizona state representative. He served in office in the early 2010s and was, as Mike noted, a candidate for Secretary of State. Is that right, Mike?
Right,
Okay.
correct.
He's also a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, a commissioned officer in the Marine Corps. Education as an engineer and a lawyer. He is a federal, native, and tribal law expert and currently practices energy law. So Chris Deschaney, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours. Anybody see Chris? Or Chris, are you on mute?
Hey, Chris, you should be able to have the ability to unmute yourself there. He may have stepped away for just a second. What we can go ahead and do is give everybody a couple-minute break, about 5 minutes to stand up, stretch, grab some water, and then we'll jump in. Hopefully we'll have Chris when we come back, and then jump into our Q&A session. So I will give us a little countdown here. And we will see everyone in 5 minutes.
Oh yeah.
All right, we are
My
back.
name is Ariel, and I just started my first job as a project manager. When I was a
Please
student,
just keep
I'd
talking.
write long essays.
Yeah, Sarah, there you go.
There you go.
All right, do we have Krista Cheney with us?
He should be there. There he is.
There we go. Oh, no, still showing mute.
There you go.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, I can hear you now.
Oh.
Hi, forgive me. I'm in a really public place, but I'll do the best I can.
Okay, well, the floor is yours to talk about Native and the tribal voting rights in kind of in a historical context.
Sure. Okay, so we just heard a great presentation, and there's a lot of information that we can take from that. But with respect to tribal governments and tribal communities and tribal voters as individuals, some of the basic, I guess, basic issues that we're dealing with in terms of tribes is really dealing with the federal government pushing policies like assimilation and looking to try to eliminate tribes from really the mainstream of America. And so when we quickly do kind of a look at federal American Indian history, we start with Contact, what we call Contact, 1492. And then we go through a number of years as a young country, as it's building through the colonies, a time that folks refer to as the treaty period. And so when this country and other countries dealt with tribes, they dealt with them in terms of treaties as equals. And so if we look into the Constitution, tribes are referred to in the Constitution. They're also just stated in the Declaration of Independence. And so tribes have been with us, or this country, since the beginning. And what's the takeaway I'd like to share is that the course of dealings that the tribes have gained during that time was on a treaty level. Now, starting with the new United States, 1789, what started to happen was with the creation of the federal judicial system, we started having policies like removal. And so that's the next step what tribes dealt with in terms of removing them from their original homelands. And that's why you hear the great stories of the Cherokee Trail of Tears, you hear the removal to the Oklahomas, you hear the westward expansion. And so tribes were being removed as the country grew and it became stronger, had more resources, and were pushing towards the west. So this period was roughly from 1810 through 1840s. And then in the 1840s through I would say late 60s, early 70s, you had a lot of conflict because of the American Civil War, the whole issues regarding states' rights, and the whole nature between the states fighting for representation in the government. At this same time, as the United States matured, it started creating policies, and what we call them are really policies, plenary power, where the judicial system created doctrine out of nothing to justify, say, land removals. They justified, jurisdiction over tribes, and addressing things like dealing with the distribution of resources that tribes originally negotiated under the treaty. And at the same time, the United States started taking land. And so it was also called the allotment era. So late 1880s to the early 1920s. So all of this happened. And all through this time, tribes were not considered voting eligible. Tribal members were not citizens. And it was not until the there was an act passed in the late 1910s that gave tribes citizenship. But even with that, tribes were not allowed to vote. Not until, in some states like Arizona, tribes weren't allowed to vote until after World War II. And even up until the late 70s, my parents, my grandparents still talk about restrictions and barriers that made it hard for them to vote. This was in Apache County, Navajo County, Coconino County in Arizona. And if we look at the struggles that were occurring in the South with regards to voting rights, if we said, okay, where's the second worst place in America with terms with discrimination, the disenfranchisement of voting class of people or demographic, that happened in Apache County. And so we focus a lot on other areas like the South, but Apache County in Arizona did have one of the worst records with regards to preventing natives from voting. So now we go to today, after termination, after allotment era, after, let me back up 2 steps. So after World War II, the federal government tried to terminate tribes and eliminate tribes. That wasn't successful. So then what they went into was assimilating tribes. And that's where you had a lot of folks that were shipped off to Indian schools all over the country. And when that happened, coupled with the inability for folks from the reservations, like my grandparents, we still had voting challenges that were occurring, even though, for example, in the state of Arizona, Arizona Supreme Court ruled that, hey, tribes are allowed to vote. They can vote we still had these challenges decades later. And even in my timeline and my experience as a candidate in 2008, this is Obama's running a national campaign. We, my wife and I, had to fight a voting election issue dealing with representation and having rural voters select their candidates through the signature process. And through that process, the challenger or the proponent or the person filing this claim against me basically said, we want to eliminate this demographic of voters in Arizona who don't have a physical address and therefore are not allowed to choose voters, choose their voters as it relates to selecting through the signature process, and therefore tried to disqualify me. And so we fought that. We won, and we remained on the ballot, won the election hands down, and then began to work on some policies, legislation, and then I'm happy to say that through my work with Albert Hale, Senator Albert Hale and myself, we were able to pass a law within the Arizona legislature and protect not only rural voters, but tribal voters, and this whole issue surrounding PO boxes and rural addresses as it relates to being able to sign off on a petition for a candidate. Now, nationally, another thing that we've done in the last two elections, but focused really in the last election of 2020, we created a group, a loose coalition of 501c3s and C4s that are working regionally throughout the United States, banded together to create what we call Battleground Indian Country. And Battleground Indian Country had representatives in all the key states that the political focusing on. So for us, it was North Carolina, Nevada, Arizona. We had representation in Michigan, Iowa, and then we also targeted a couple key cities that were in other battleground states like Ohio. So Ohio had Columbus, Cleveland, and Dayton that we looked at because they all have urban, tribal, and Indian populations. And so we went out to these regional intertribal to see if we can not only encourage and do voter registration, voter education, and get folks out to vote. And we were successful in raising a number of dollars to fund four main states: North Carolina, Iowa, Nevada, and Arizona. And I'm happy to say that we won in Arizona, we won in Nevada, and I feel like we were 50-50 in North Carolina, and we lost Iowa. But what that allowed us to do is create a national network of Battleground Indian voting rights advocates to work nationally, and now are going to formalize this group into a 501c3 and C4, so that Battleground Indian Country will be ready for subsequent elections going forward. And so I'm happy to be a part of that. I do apologize for making it brief and a little informal, but I definitely want to share that tribes, Indian Country, we're all working hard as well. And as we build our networks and reach out, improve our capacities, we'll be working side by side with the existing groups that are protecting voting rights throughout the United States. So I'll leave it there. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer a question or two.
Let me get off mute there. Thank you so much, Chris, for joining us today, and we can bring on Lisa and Barbara back as well for Q&A. The first question, I'll go ahead and ask the first question. How does what we're going through right now parallel with, and Lisa did a great job in discussing this. Kind of discuss the parallels of the historical context, the historical fight for voting rights, and what we're seeing now with the current attempts to suppress voting in the United States. And I'll let anyone address that wants to.
Well, I'll start us. One of the things that Lisa talked about is the entirety of the arguments around state rights. We saw that very much in this battle last week in the Senate, where people were saying that the use of the federal authority that's guaranteed by the Constitution to Congress to regulate federal elections, which is all the act did, by the way. The act did not impose or say that it was abridging or changing any state law, but it basically said that for the operations of federal elections, that's congressional, Senate, and presidential, that you had to allow, to mandate these changes and to make these laws uniform throughout the nation. Now, people will say, a lot of people say, what do you mean by that? There are basically, when you go to vote, you're voting for, state elections, local elections, and you're voting a lot for, what the federal elections. Congress is every 2 years. A lot of states have off election years, just like we just had Virginia's election for gubernatorial, etc. But when there's a federal election for Congress, for the Senate, for president, Congress has always had the right to regulate them. And in fact, that's very clear because Congress sets the date of the federal election. Congress sets the timing of those elections. Congress, set the whole process for how votes are counted, et cetera, which is why there's an Electoral Count Act being talked about right now. But what is important to understand is when you affirm a federal standard for voting, the states then have to decide if they're going to have what's called a dual electoral system, meaning that you will run one system for federal elections and one system for state elections. Frankly, no state has ever been able to do that successfully. They tried in Mississippi and they were struck down. They tried in Kansas, and they were struck down. There's never been a state that's been able to do that because look at the problems we have just training poll workers on average, electoral processes. So that's never been able to work, that you could run two different systems. So whatever the federal standard becomes an obligation to the states to do across the board. And that's why they hated this act so much, because they did not want to have to do same-day election registration, automatic voter registration. They didn't want to re-enfranchise, people who had been denied the vote on the basis of having have a felony record in their background, as too many states allow, or to be on parole or probation. All of those prohibitions against some. If you take the ones that outright ban, like Arizona, Florida, etc., you have like 6 million people. But then when you add the discouraged people who are afraid to register because they don't know if they can, believe it or not, folks, that's another 9 million people to an estimated 9 to 13 to 17 million possible people. Think about it, 51 million people aren't registered in the United States who are eligible to be registered. A good population of those are the discouraged and the confused on the basis of these felony convictions, because we over-criminalize everything, we over-prosecute people, and there are too many millions of people who have felony records in their background. And by the way, a lot of people get this twisted. It's not just Black folks. It's disproportionately Black and brown. But of those millions I was talking about, of the 6 million, only 1.8 are Black. So we're talking about a lot of white voters who are alienated and isolated from the voting process on the basis of a felony conviction. So that part of the law was really important. That was not, allowed. But I just, I think that people need to, understand that these parallels are there. In the after slavery was over, the South desperately needed labor. Remember, this is the era of the expansion of the railroad system. The railroad system becomes the most important advancement, most important infrastructural need in the United States during post-slavery era. And they had been using slaves to build the railroads. So all of a sudden, post-emancipation, the railroads now have to pay people and they don't want to do it. And a lot of other people who have been living and existing and making their fortunes off of slave-free labor all of a sudden have to pay for it. So what they do is they criminalize them. You can see Douglas Blackman's book, Slavery by Another Name, that really documents this era of how there was so much criminalization of African Americans, and then the writing that criminalization with disenfranchisement under the 14th Amendment, 13th Amendment, disenfranchisement of their right to vote. So this is just one thing that we just got to keep in mind, that these issues haven't gone away. The reality of white structural racism, which is what we're talking about, is that it's embedded, it's entrenched, it reinforces itself constantly. It comes up with the same old arguments, the same old stereotypes, the same old justifications, and then it'll create new ones, like the dead ghosts of Cesar Chavez or whatever they were talking about, all these nonsense things that they come up with, or the alleged Shanghai machines that are taking over the voting. But it's all based on fear. It's all based on opposition to a multiracial democracy. And that's what we've had to, fight, throughout these years. And the same stereotypes. People don't vote because they're lazy. There is no real voting suppression because I've never seen a long line in my life. Well, thank God you haven't, but you're white, and that's why you haven't seen it. And you don't think about that. I don't understand why people can't get an ID. It's not that hard, really. That's because you got a car, you got money, you got time, you got a job, you can do that. All of these things that we hear, that we've heard before. And once again, when you read the George White speech, you will see these recurrent themes and how, what I always tell people is that racism never, ever gets eradicated. It just goes underground and it festers underground, and it resurfaces whenever there is a period of history that allows it to resurface. And sadly, the Trump administration gave a whole lot of legitimation to people's ability to express openly their racial fears, their racial resentment, their racial hostility. And it has been, and it's, carrying over into our democracy, where people see the fight, being the most prominent. So it's a battle. We got, we have to be aware of it. And I'm mad because, I watch all these stupid headlines on CNN and other stations where they just get this wrong. They just say, oh, well, it was about election integrity. Not a bit, never has been. They say it was about the conservative agenda. No, there's no conservative agenda. This is an amoral agenda. It's an agenda that wants to make sure that white male dominance in our elections can predominate. Think about, and I'll end here. Just think about this. What is the percentage of women in the average state legislature? Not saying that all women are progressive. That's by far not true. But the average state legislature, Nevada being an exception, there's one other state that's an exception, is around 25% women. And that is just wrong when 52% of all voters are women. So we just know that there's so many barriers in this nation to a full democracy. And something like less than 5%, and some legislatures are underneath the age of 40. So there's a whole series of demographics that aren't represented in our quote democracy. And that's why it's got to become more inclusive and more multiracial.
Yeah, building off that brilliant lead, absolutely, there's so much continuity going on here around questions of just the rebuilding and the maintenance and the challenges to white supremacy, which are, are pushing back now and saying no. But I did want to point out just a few, and in my talk, it was all about the continuity of refusing to create a right to vote. But I did want to point out a few things that I do think are new. And one of them, Ms. Arnwine has continually underscored, which is that the birth rate, there has always been a fear of white suicide in the United States, right? That if white women don't have enough babies, right? This is eugenics, this is sterilization, this is, all kinds of things. That the white birth rate would be outstripped by the birth rate of folks of color. And this would be sort of a monumental disaster for the United States and a kind of white supremacist vision of our nation. And that you can find that fear, really all across, particularly, really by the end of the 19th century, it's kind of epic. But the thing is that finally has now happened. It was never true before. It was just this kind of moniker of, you better watch out. But starting in around 2016, the non-white birth rate slightly outstripped the white birth rate. And the thing is, and I've got some charts on this, I could show them, but the only demographic racially that votes overwhelmingly Republican, that votes majority Republican, is white folks, okay? And that includes white women. But white folks vote like 50 some percent, Republican, and then 40 some percent Democratic. All other racial demographics vote majority, a pretty hefty majority Democratic. And Black women vote like 98% Democratic. Like Black women essentially like hold down, they are the backbone of the Democratic Party. So if if you look at this kind of coming, right, as these people, if that was like 2016, those kids are now, the demographic is switching and the Republican Party does not have the vote of the demographic that is coming. And that's also new in America, right? And the other thing that I would say that's new is that we have moved into territory that is absolutely new in the sense that this is no longer about suppressing voting rights. This is about delegitimizing and overturning elections. We have now moved into absolutely new territory, I think. And I think this whole idea about voter suppression and stuff, and the idea has really been about, it was about suppressing the vote, and it has very successfully done that. But it's also, I think, part of a broader agenda, which is to just delegitimize elections generally, so that people in power can then just kind of call the election whichever way they want, and then argue that it was part of a democratic process. And if you look at the ways in which many of the elections boards are currently being taken over by Republican Party operatives and things like that, so that they can now claim in the future that they will overturn the will of the people or the election result, arguing that it's fraudulent, and the real election result is this. So I think the thing we really have to watch out for, and that I do think is new, is this, that's not so new. Overturning election results happened all the time in the South, but what's new is that it's really affecting like a kind of national, it would have happened with Boss Tweed and all that. But I think that at least, the overturning of a presidential election and the violent assault on the Capitol to try to have a coup in the United States by white supremacists should worry us far beyond the question of voter suppression, I guess is what I mean to say. So,
well can I just add one thing on that really quickly?
Please.
I think what we all miss is the anti-democracy movement. That there are people who are just anti-democracy.
Yeah,
and we know Putin is absolutely anti-democracy, and all these other authoritarian governments throughout the world. And we've had this rise in authoritarianism throughout the world, and their whole game is to delegitimize democracies.
That's right.
And so they love it when you have, somebody like a President Trump running around saying that the election was stolen, it was illegitimate, or And those are the kinds of things they love, because their goal is to squash and destroy democracy.
Yeah.
So that it's not a legitimate form of governance anywhere in the world. And we got to understand that that's part of this battle, that voter suppression is one of the tools that they're using. Election subversion is another one of those tools. There's so much wrong, white supremacist yearning and nostalgia. They're using all of this, but one of the goals is the destruction of democracy. So when I talk about who our opponents are, I call them anti-democracy forces, because that's what they are. Because ultimately, they don't care what governance it is, as long as they rule. The other big difference we didn't talk about is corporate power in this.
Yeah.
What Citizens United has done to this country is absolutely obscene. And that a lot of the corporate powers in this country hate the very voters you were talking about, because they feel that they're too pro government assistance. They're too pro corporate regulation, which they are. They're very strong about corporations being regulated. So they don't like it. So that's why you see so much money from the corporate sector going into these anti-democracy forces. Don't let us not, miss the full parameters of what we're fighting against, because otherwise we make all the wrong strategic decisions in how to fight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would also recommend, I'm just on that idea that this is anti-democracy and this is authoritarianism. And, a part of, this is just a piece of a much broader strategy to check out either online talks by or the very big book of Nancy MacLean called Democracy in Chains, which explains a kind of radical right kind of corporate agenda to basically end any degree of a state that actually provides services for people, but just becomes a vehicle for people to amass, the really top elites to amass wealth. And really, to do that, they're going to have to sort of destroy American democracy. And this is to the Koch brothers and this whole thing. And she doesn't actually see them as part of the Republican Party so much as they're a kind of radical fringe that has leveraged, opportunities within the Republican Party. But I would highly recommend checking out a talk or something by her, because really, it goes to the point, great point just made, that this is so much bigger than suppression of voting rights. This is
suppression of voting rights is central to their agenda.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. You can't get away from the voter suppression. It's central.
No.
It's their central instrument of this. But
Totally
election
agree.
Subversion is there too. Yes.
Right. Good discussion on that. Next question is, I think this is more for Professor Tetral. How would an amendment use the phrase "right to vote" if one does not exist? So I guess that's the existing amendments that we have say the right to vote, but it does not exist.
That's right. Because there's a lot of absurdity in all kinds of documents. Like we say, this Constitution's all about slavery, but it doesn't mention slavery, right? The idea, I think the reason it's there is because the idea has been so powerful in American history, right? The idea has, even if it doesn't exist legally, the idea has been enormously powerful. It has motivated, massive social movements and all kinds of challenges. And so, I can't speak to exactly why it's there, but I think that anyone looking at the language of laws and the language of political argument would understand that it's rife with absurdity and kind of Orwellian like nonsense, and in some ways, and that's the language everyone was using at the time. So I think in some ways, a lot of those social activists themselves didn't stop to kind of think about, okay, what is this? So we just take for granted that it exists. So.
Yeah, we got about 4 more minutes. We'll do one more question. KJ in Berlin, Connecticut says, voting rights seem to be a metaphor for power struggles. Why is it baked into some people that others don't deserve to have a voice regardless of their differences? Why not codifying, voting, women's rights, abortion, all that stuff? So we can get onto bigger issues. So I guess the question here is, rights, we seem to be comfortable getting to a point with the right to vote, our rights. But we get into a discussion on otherism that, and I think our politicians really fed into this idea that if I give them rights, then I'm taking away something from you.
Yeah, I think that's, there is, that great shirt that's like, rights are not pie, it's like, a slice for me doesn't mean less for you, like there's enough for every, it's not a zero sum game, right? But, and, there is that sense, but I also think, what was I going to say? No, I've totally lost my train of thought. You know how that goes. Anyway, I'll be quiet for a minute until it comes back to me and see what other people want to say.
Well, there's just so much to say.
I know.
There is, and I just, I wanted to, plug again, our session that we're going to do tomorrow on Facebook Live on where do we go from here. For those of you who are on the activist side, we're going to really be talking about the activism, and we're going to be talking about the post-Senate vote, agenda. So I really, encourage people and, to join us in Selma, the 3rd through the 6th, because there's going to be 5 more days after the 6th, because they're going to do the entirety of the Selma to Montgomery March. So there will be events all the way through the 11th. And we will be, Transformative Justice Coalition will be part of that. We're going to be active in 2020. We were active in 32 states. We're going to be definitely active in quite a number of states, including a lot of them that I saw in the chat box that you're from. Sadly, fortunately, we don't have to go to Berlin, but there will be, plenty to do. And I'm hoping that, people will absolutely, take this to the next level, because what we need in this moment is not only understanding and awareness, but we need activism. We need the voters to be educated, because all of these vicious voter suppression laws, the way we won, when I say we won, I mean the way we got everybody to be able to vote, to have the largest turnout in modern day history for the United States, was that we taught voters we educated voters, we called voters, we postcarded voters, we walked the streets and canvassed voters. We did everything we could. And that's why we were able to have the turnout that we had. That's why we were able to have the least voter spoilage in the history of the United States for mail-in ballots and absentee ballots. I mean, all of that was our work. And when I say our work, I mean collectively all our work. And one thing, Chris, I know you would have loved to have talked about are the provisions of the Native American Voting Rights Act, which we did not get to talk about. And those amazing provisions that were also part of this legislation that got voted down. Also, there was a youth protection, the Youth Voting Rights Protection Act, that also got knocked down. That would have provided better protections for young voters. There's just so much that we could talk about on this, but I just did want to make those activism points.
Yeah, and we'll be getting into other aspects of voting rights in our future discussions, and we'd love to have everyone join us again for that. But we've sadly reached the end of our show tonight. I want to turn it back over to Sarah for a few last words.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. And to our amazing panel, thank you all so much for giving us a couple hours on your Sunday. It was amazing to hear everything you had to say, and thanks so much for answering questions. Just a couple real quick before we head on out. One, you guys all saw a lot of really incredible resources, links, information was dropped into the chat. I will be taking all of that, getting it into an email along with a link to this presentation. So for our panelists, if there's anything else you would like for that email to include about the Selma event or anything else, please shoot it on over to me. We'll make sure that everyone who participated today gets that. And I know we've seen a lot of new names, new faces. So there are a lot of you that maybe are not familiar with us as a people, as an organization of people. So I wanted to note a few things. One, David mentioned, this is the first in the series of this citizen engagement forum that we do. We have a follow-up Voting in America Part 2. Obviously, we could keep going now. So this is a discussion that could keep on happening. And we have Part 2 scheduled for March 2nd. So look for that registration up soon and who those guest panelists will be, and a few other events that'll also be a part of that as well. We have a conversation on the Electoral College that'll be happening on February 16th. It's another registration coming up. We have also a couple of other things in other areas. We do a facilitation training program. It's a 4-part series we offer to anyone interested in kind of really developing some facilitation skills and how to, those techniques for having those hard conversations in a constructive way. This year is also going to mark our 4th annual National Assembly event. And we are including some regional in-person events this year that we're really excited about. So if you want to learn more about that, I will include that in the email that's going out as well. And we have a newsletter. So I will drop a sign up in the chat here before we go, and also in the email follow-up. Everything that we have going on goes into our newsletter that happens weekly, and would love to be able to get that out to you if that's something that would be helpful. Here is the sign up coming at you. So thank you again so much to everyone for your time. And again, to our panelists, it was really an incredible afternoon spent with you. So thank you.
Sarah, quick comment. I got a message from Chris. His connection dropped, but he thanked everybody, and he promises to stay in touch and all the special cases on Native rights. I would also just end with one quick comment, which I'm sure many of you know. Reverend Raphael Warnock, who's not only the senator from Georgia, who I'm sure Barbara knows, but also as the successor to the pulpit of Ebenezer Baptist from Daddy King and Martin Luther King Jr. To focus at the end point, he said the right to vote, which now is in question thanks to Dr. Tetro, but the right to vote is the essential right without which all other votes are meaningless.
Right.
So our discussion this afternoon could not be more important. And thanks to everybody who contributed in making it so interesting and successful.
And he was quoting the Supreme Court, by the way.
There you go.
And that's why this whole issue about the right to vote is a very contentious one. And but anyway, but he was quoting, that's a quote out of the Supreme Court that's been reaffirmed in several cases. But anyway, it's there's a lot.
Which case, Barbara? Can you?
Well, it's he linked it from Wick Yo all the way up to, of course, all the way up to Brennan's, decision in the, in the one person, one vote case.
Reynolds v. Sims. Yeah. Okay.
Aaron and all those. Yes.
Yeah.
So,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. The Supreme Court's been very
back and forth. They haven't been consistent. They haven't been consistent. They've been very back and forth on this issue of the right to vote. But you're right though. I mean, the most recent pronouncements have been, about the privilege.
So Barbara, you were there when it was 98-0 in the Senate on 2006.
Darn straight. They used our research, it was just crazy to watch, the Collins, and to watch all the 16, come up with these new excuses for not voting for, voter protection, including, I couldn't believe her, yelling about the 700 plus pages. I was like, excuse me, how long was the tax bill? The amendments itself probably were as long as this vote. So it was just stupid. It was just so funny to watch how they, reach and grab and come up with any kind of justification to deny the right to vote. We got real work, folks. This is probably the biggest threat to democracy in the US ever.
It is, in the world, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
God bless. Thanks, everybody. Thanks a million.
Thank
For
you.
the rest of your Sunday.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, David, Sarah,
Thanks so
everybody.
much.
Yeah, thank you everybody
Thanks
for
so
joining
much.
us, and hope to see you in the future.